Ma'am, step away from the vehicle. Naomi Carter froze with 1 hand inches from the driver's door of her charcoal gray SUV, the soft chirp of the unlocked doors still hanging in the evening air. She turned slowly and found a uniformed police officer standing about 12 feet behind her beneath the white glow of a parking lot light. Officer Bradley Hayes watched her with the focused suspicion of someone who believed he had interrupted something. Naomi looked briefly at the grocery bag beside her feet, then at the key fob in her hand, then back at him. Is there a problem, officer? Hayes moved closer, stopping several feet away. I asked you to step away from the vehicle. Naomi did exactly that. She took 2 calm steps to the side and kept both hands visible. Across the shopping center parking lot, cars rolled past the storefronts while families pushed carts toward their vehicles. Somewhere nearby, a police radio crackled. Nothing about the evening had felt unusual until that moment. Whose vehicle is this? Hayes asked. Naomi studied his face. Mine. His eyes moved from her plain black jacket and jeans to the SUV, then back to her. This is your vehicle? That is what I said. Hayes glanced toward a second patrol officer standing near a cruiser roughly 30 feet away. Officer Eric Dalton had been speaking into his radio, but now he was watching them. Hayes turned back to Naomi. Do you have something showing that? Naomi lifted the key fob slightly. I just unlocked it. That does not prove ownership. The words were calm, almost routine, but Naomi recognized the problem immediately. It was not the question itself. Police officers asked questions every day. Sometimes strange circumstances had perfectly reasonable explanations, and sometimes reasonable-looking circumstances did not. What mattered was whether facts changed the direction of an encounter. Naomi had spent enough years around law enforcement to understand that difference better than most people ever would. My registration is inside the vehicle, she said. Hayes looked toward the driver's door. Do not reach inside yet. Naomi lowered the key fob. All right. Hayes seemed almost surprised by how easily she complied. What are you doing here? Shopping. At this hour? Naomi glanced toward the brightly illuminated grocery store behind him. Customers were still entering and leaving through the automatic doors. It is 7:20 in the evening. Hayes did not respond to that. Instead, he asked, Where do you live? Naomi's expression changed slightly. Not anger. Attention. She had been cooperative. She had explained the vehicle belonged to her. She had offered access to the registration. Yet the questions were moving farther away from anything connected to the SUV. Officer, she said, why are you asking where I live? Hayes shifted his stance. I am trying to understand what is going on. I can help with that. I bought groceries. I walked to my vehicle. I unlocked it. Then you told me to step away. Dalton began walking toward them now, his expression uncertain. Hayes glanced at him, then returned his attention to Naomi. Identification. Naomi reached slowly toward her purse, then stopped before touching it. May I get it? Hayes nodded. She removed her driver's license and held it out. He took it, read the name, and looked at her again. Naomi Carter. For the briefest moment, something passed across his face, as though the name almost meant something. Then it disappeared. Wait here, he said. Naomi watched him turn toward the patrol car with her license in his hand. Officer Hayes. He stopped and looked back. Naomi stood beneath the parking lot light, calm, composed, and increasingly certain that this encounter had never really been about whether the SUV belonged to her. What specific offense do you think I committed? Hayes stared at her. He had expected nervousness. He had expected confusion. What he had not expected was that question. Less than an hour earlier, Naomi Carter had been standing beneath the bright lights of a municipal building downtown, waiting for an elevator and thinking about nothing more dramatic than dinner. It had been a long day, the kind that left the mind crowded with unfinished conversations, paperwork, and decisions that would still be waiting tomorrow morning. When the elevator arrived, Naomi stepped inside. With 2 city employees, offered them a tired smile, and rode silently toward the underground parking garage. At 38, she had learned how important ordinary evenings could become. No emergencies. No difficult conversations. No responsibility for anyone except herself. When the elevator doors opened, Naomi walked toward her SUV, placed a leatherwork bag on the passenger seat, and removed the dark jacket she had worn throughout the day. Her clothing was simple and professional: black pants, a charcoal blouse, comfortable shoes. Nothing about her appearance announced what she did for a living. That suited her. There were days when Naomi appreciated becoming just another face in the crowd after work. She started the engine and checked her phone before leaving the garage. 3 messages waited. One was from her mother asking whether she had remembered to buy the coffee she liked. Naomi smiled. She called her immediately. "I remembered," Naomi said when her mother answered. "You said that last week. Last week was different. That is what you always say." Naomi laughed softly as she pulled onto the street. Their conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes, drifting from groceries to a cousin's upcoming birthday and whether Naomi was working too much again. "I am going home after one stop," Naomi promised. "That is what you said yesterday. You keep excellent records." Somebody has to. When the call ended, Naomi felt lighter. The city moved around her beneath the fading evening sky, headlights beginning to appear as office workers made their way home. She drove about 4 miles before turning into a shopping center anchored by a large grocery store. The parking lot was busy but ordinary. Parents loaded bags into minivans. A teenager pushed a row of shopping carts toward the entrance. 2 patrol cars were parked near the far side of the lot, their emergency lights off. Naomi noticed them automatically, then continued driving. Years of professional habit made certain details impossible not to see, even when she was off duty. She parked beneath a light pole, locked the SUV, and walked inside. 20 minutes later, she emerged carrying 1 grocery bag and a cup of coffee. Her phone showed 7:18. She sent her mother a photograph of the coffee package with the message, "Mission accomplished." Then she slipped the phone into her purse and headed toward the SUV. Across the lot, Officer Bradley Hayes was standing beside one of the patrol cars with Officer Eric Dalton. They had responded to an unrelated call about a disagreement between 2 customers near another business, a matter that had already been resolved without incident. Dalton was entering notes into the vehicle computer when Hayes looked across the parking lot. His attention settled on Naomi. She had reached the charcoal gray SUV and placed her grocery bag beside the driver's door while searching her purse for the key fob. Hayes watched for several seconds. "You know her?" he asked. Dalton glanced up. "Who?" Hayes nodded toward Naomi. "Woman by the SUV." Dalton looked briefly, then returned to his screen. "No, that should have been the end of it." Naomi found the key fob and pressed the button. The SUV lights flashed. The doors unlocked with a familiar chirp. She reached toward the handle. Behind her, footsteps approached across the pavement. Then a voice cut through the ordinary sounds of the parking lot. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." Naomi stopped. The peaceful evening she had planned was over before she even understood why. Naomi had always believed that the clearest test of authority came when nobody knew you had any. Off duty, there was no visible badge on her belt, no department radio at her shoulder, no rank displayed beside her name. There was only Naomi Carter, a 38-year-old black woman trying to buy groceries, remember her mother's coffee, and get home before the evening disappeared. That anonymity usually felt like freedom. Inside the grocery store, she had moved through the aisles without urgency, comparing 2 brands of coffee before choosing the one her mother preferred, adding fruit, vegetables, pasta, and a container of soup to her basket. At the checkout counter, the cashier recognized her from previous visits but knew nothing about her profession. "Long day?" the young woman asked. Naomi smiled. "Long enough. At least. You made it before the evening rush." Naomi glanced toward the windows where daylight was fading into blue-gray twilight. That might be the best thing that happened today. She paid, thanked the cashier, and carried 1 grocery bag toward the exit. For those few minutes, she was exactly what she appeared to be, another customer heading home. Yet years of training had shaped habits she could not simply switch off. Naomi noticed exits when she entered a building. She noticed arguments before voices became loud. She noticed when someone seemed lost, frightened, or unusually focused on another person. She did not live in fear. She simply observed. That skill had become part of her long before the evening in the parking lot. More than a decade earlier, Naomi had entered law enforcement believing competence would speak for itself. Experience had taught her that competence mattered, but patience mattered too. She had worked cases where frightened witnesses needed time before they trusted anyone. She had supervised younger officers who mistook confidence for certainty. Again and again, she reminded them of the same principle: facts first, conclusions second. A good officer did not force reality to fit an assumption. A good officer allowed evidence to change the assumption. Naomi carried that principle into her private life as naturally as she carried her car keys. When she stepped outside the store, the air had cooled. She balanced the grocery bag in one hand and her coffee in the other, then crossed the parking lot toward her SUV. Her mother's message appeared on her phone before she reached it. "Do not forget to eat something besides coffee." Naomi smiled and typed back, "I bought actual food." Miracles happen. She slipped the phone away and placed the grocery bag beside the driver's door while searching for her key fob. Roughly 80 feet away, two uniformed officers stood near their patrol vehicles. Naomi noticed them but gave them little thought. She had seen thousands of uniforms during her career. Tonight, she wanted distance from work. She pressed the key fob. The SUV responded immediately, its lights flashing once as the doors unlocked. Naomi reached toward the handle, expecting to put away the groceries and drive home. Then she heard footsteps approaching from behind. The command came moments later, firm enough to make nearby shoppers look over. Naomi stepped away exactly as instructed. She answered questions. She kept her hands visible. She offered access to the registration. She produced her driver's license when asked. And now, as Bradley Hayes stood holding that license beneath the parking lot lights, Naomi watched the encounter with the same disciplined attention she had taught other officers to use. She was not yet angry. She was measuring. The question was simple. Would new facts change his assumption, or would his assumption keep changing the standard? Bradley Hayes did not answer Naomi's question immediately. Instead, he looked down at her driver's license again, then toward the charcoal gray SUV as if one of them had to contain the explanation he wanted. Officer Eric Dalton had reached them by then and stopped several feet away. "What have we got?" Dalton asked. Hayes held up Naomi's license. "Checking something out." Dalton glanced at Naomi, then at the grocery bag beside the vehicle. "Related to the call?" "Maybe." Naomi noticed that word. The call Hayes and Dalton had handled earlier had involved two customers arguing near another business on the opposite side of the shopping center. Naomi had not been there. She had not spoken to either person. She had simply walked out of a grocery store and unlocked her own vehicle. "Officer Hayes," Naomi said, "you still have not told me what offense you believe you are investigating." Hayes returned his attention to her. "I do not need to explain every step of an investigation while I am conducting it." Naomi kept her voice even. "I am asking what connects me to your investigation." Dalton looked toward Hayes. "Brad." Hayes ignored him. "How long have you owned this vehicle?" 3 years. "Where did you buy it?" Naomi paused. The question was not impossible to answer. That was precisely why it mattered. A person could spend an entire evening answering possible questions without ever learning why those questions were being asked. "The registration will establish ownership," she said. Hayes looked toward the driver's door. "You said it is inside?" "Yes." "Where?" "Glove compartment." Hayes considered that, then handed her license to Dalton. "Hold this." He turned back to Naomi. "You can retrieve the registration. Move slowly." Naomi nodded. "I am going to open the driver's door, lean inside, and reach across to the glove compartment." Dalton's eyes moved toward her with sudden attention. Most civilians did not narrate their movements with that kind of precision. Hayes noticed it too. "You have done this before?" he asked. Naomi opened the door without answering. She retrieved the registration, closed the door, and handed the document to Dalton. He compared the information with her license. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Name matches." Hayes took the registration. "Address to?" "Yes." "Vehicle identification?" Dalton looked through the windshield toward the dashboard, then checked the document. "Looks right." For a moment, Naomi expected the encounter to end. The key had worked. Her license matched the registration. The registration matched the vehicle. Every factual question about ownership now had an answer. But Hayes did not hand anything back. "Why are you shopping this far from your address?" he asked. Naomi stared at him. Dalton turned his head slowly. "Brad." Hayes looked at him. "What?" "Everything matches." "I can see that." "Then what are we doing?" The question came from his own partner now. Hayes glanced toward the grocery store and then back at Naomi. "People use vehicles that belong to other people all the time." Naomi's expression remained controlled, but something inside her settled into certainty. This was no longer verification. Verification had already happened. "Officer Hayes," she said, "you asked whether the vehicle was mine. I gave you documentation proving that it is. What new fact are you investigating now?" Hayes folded the registration against her license. You seem unusually concerned about routine questions. Naomi looked directly at him. No, I am concerned that every time I answer one question, you replace it with another. Dalton lowered his eyes for a second. Hayes did not. Around them, the parking lot continued moving beneath the evening lights, ordinary people carrying ordinary bags toward ordinary cars. Naomi had spent years teaching officers that facts were supposed to narrow suspicion. Standing beside her own SUV, she watched Hayes do the opposite. The evidence was becoming clearer. His suspicion was becoming broader. Bradley Hayes stood beneath the parking lot lights with Naomi's license and registration in his hands, staring at documents that had already answered the question he claimed to be asking. The name matched. The address matched. The vehicle information matched. Even the key fob in Naomi's hand had unlocked the SUV before he approached her. Officer Eric Dalton looked from the paperwork to Hayes and seemed ready to return everything. "We are good here," Dalton said quietly. Hayes did not move. Maybe. Naomi heard the word and felt the evening shift again. She had spent years watching inexperienced officers make mistakes because they became emotionally attached to their first impression. Training could correct that. Experience could correct that. A good partner could correct that. But correction only worked when someone was willing to accept it. "Officer Hayes," Naomi said, "is there another reason you are keeping me here?" Hayes looked at her. "I never said I was keeping you here." "Then am I free to leave?" Dalton's attention immediately returned to Hayes. It was a simple question, one every trained officer understood. Hayes glanced toward the patrol vehicle before answering. "Just wait while we finish checking everything." Naomi nodded once. "Then I am not free to leave. Do not put words in my mouth. I am asking you to clarify your instruction." Hayes exhaled through his nose. "Why are you making this difficult?" Naomi almost smiled at the irony, but she did not. "I unlocked my vehicle. I provided identification. I provided registration. Every document matches. I have answered your questions. I am asking what fact still requires me to remain here." Several yards away, an older man pushing a shopping cart slowed as he approached his sedan. His name was Marcus Reed, though Naomi did not know that yet. He had seen Hayes stop her and had heard enough of the exchange to understand that something unusual was happening. He did not interfere. He simply remained near his vehicle, watching. Dalton lowered his voice. "Brad, the paperwork checks out." Hayes turned toward him. "I heard you. So what else are we verifying?" "I said I am handling it." Dalton's expression tightened. Naomi recognized the dynamic immediately. One officer had begun questioning the decision, but the other treated that question as disloyalty rather than caution. Hayes looked back at Naomi. "You seem very familiar with police procedure." "I understand my rights." "That is not what I said." "Then what are you asking?" Hayes studied her. "Have you had contact with law enforcement before?" Naomi held his gaze. There it was. Another question. Another direction. Another attempt to explain why she did not fit the role he had assigned her. "Yes," she said. Hayes seemed interested immediately. "What kind of contact?" "Professional." Dalton looked at her more carefully. Naomi continued before Hayes could ask another question. "But that does not change the issue in front of us. You stopped me because you questioned whether this vehicle belonged to me. You now have proof that it does." Hayes folded the registration against her license. "People can have valid paperwork and still be involved in something." "Something," Naomi repeated. "What something?" Hayes did not answer. A shopping cart rolled across the pavement somewhere behind them before stopping against a curb. The sound was ordinary, almost absurdly ordinary, against the tension gathering between three people beneath the white parking lot lights. Naomi looked toward Hayes's uniform and noticed the body camera mounted near the center of his chest. A small indicator showed that it was active. That mattered. She returned her eyes to his face. "Officer Hayes, I am going to ask one more time. What specific offense are you investigating?" His jaw tightened. "You do not get to conduct this stop." Naomi's voice remained steady. "No, but you do have to know why you are conducting it." Dalton looked away. Marcus Reed stopped pretending to arrange groceries in his trunk. And, for the first time, Hayes seemed to realize that the woman standing in front of him was not confused by his authority. She was evaluating how he was using it. Hayes held Naomi's documents a little longer, as though returning them would mean admitting the encounter had reached its natural end. Dalton stood beside him, visibly less comfortable than he had been minutes earlier. Naomi remained beside her SUV, her grocery bag still resting near the driver's door, her coffee cooling on the roof where she had placed it during the questioning. "You keep asking me what I am investigating," Hayes said. "I am making sure everything is legitimate." Naomi looked at the registration in his hand. "You have already established that the vehicle is registered to me. That is one piece of information. My driver's license matches the registration." "Yes." "The vehicle identification matches." Hayes said nothing. "And you watched me unlock the vehicle with my key." Dalton shifted his weight. "She is right, Brad." Hayes turned toward him. "I know what the documents say." "Then what is left?" Hayes looked across the parking lot, perhaps searching for an answer that had not already disappeared. The original call mentioned suspicious activity in the shopping center. Dalton frowned. The original call was two people arguing outside the pharmacy. "We already cleared that." Naomi listened carefully. "Was I described in that call?" Hayes looked at her. "I am not discussing dispatch information with you. Was my vehicle described?" "Again, you are not conducting this investigation." Naomi nodded slowly. "Then I will make the question simpler. Did you approach me because anyone reported me?" Hayes did not answer. That silence mattered more than a denial. Marcus Reed had stopped beside his sedan about 20 yards away. He was no longer pretending not to listen. A woman loading groceries into a minivan glanced toward Naomi and the officers before quietly closing her trunk. The encounter was beginning to attract attention, not because anyone was shouting, but because it had lasted too long for something that appeared so simple. Hayes looked at Naomi's SUV again. "This is a fairly expensive vehicle." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does the price of my vehicle have to do with your investigation?" Dalton looked sharply at Hayes. "Brad, I am making an observation." Naomi's voice remained level. "Then explain why that observation matters." Hayes seemed irritated by the question. "You have an answer for everything. Because you keep asking questions I can answer." For the first time, Dalton almost smiled, but the expression vanished quickly. Hayes handed Naomi's registration back, but kept her driver's license. "Where do you work?" he asked. Naomi accepted the registration and held it at her side. "Why is my employer relevant to vehicle ownership?" "It is a routine question." "Routine for what?" Hayes's expression hardened. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." Naomi felt something familiar in those words. The burden had shifted again. Hayes had approached her. Hayes had questioned the ownership of her vehicle. Hayes had received documentation confirming every relevant fact. Yet somehow her request for an explanation had become the complication. "Officer Hayes," she said, "you had a reasonable question about ownership. I answered it. You verified the answer. Now you are asking where I live, where I work, why I shop here, whether I have had contact with police, and whether I can afford the vehicle I own." Hayes interrupted. "I never said you could not afford it." "Then the price should not matter." Silence followed. Dalton looked toward the body camera on Hayes's chest, then toward his own. Both were recording. Naomi noticed the glance. She understood exactly what it meant. Facts were no longer disappearing into memory. Hayes finally raised her license. "I am going to run your name." Naomi looked directly at him. "You already have everything you need to verify my identity. Then this should not be a problem." Naomi paused, then nodded. "It is not a problem." Hayes turned toward the patrol car. Naomi's next words stopped him after 2 steps. "Please make sure your body camera stays on." Hayes looked back over his shoulder. "It is on." Naomi held his gaze. "Good." Hayes walked toward the patrol car with Naomi's driver's license still in his hand, while Dalton remained several feet from her beside the SUV. For the first time since the encounter began, the two officers were separated, and the difference between them became easier to see. Dalton glanced toward Naomi's grocery bag, then at the registration she had already provided. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "the vehicle information checks out." Naomi looked at him. "I know." Dalton nodded, uncomfortable with how obvious the statement sounded. "I mean, everything I checked matches." "Then why am I still standing here?" Dalton looked toward Hayes, who was now beside the patrol vehicle speaking into his radio. "He wants to verify your license." Naomi kept her voice calm. "My license was already visually verified against my registration." "I understand." "Do you?" Dalton met her eyes. The question was not hostile. That made it harder to dismiss. "I am not trying to argue with you," he said. "Neither am I." Naomi looked toward Hayes. "I am trying to understand the basis for this stop." Dalton did not answer. 20 yards away, Marcus Reed closed the trunk of his sedan but remained beside it. Another customer walked past, glanced at the officers, then continued toward the store. Nobody was creating a scene. Nobody needed to. The tension came from how ordinary Naomi looked standing beside a vehicle every document said belonged to her, and how extraordinary the amount of proof being demanded had become. Hayes returned several moments later. "License is valid," he said. Naomi waited for him to hand it back. He did not. "Any warrants?" Dalton asked. Hayes shook his head. "No, then we are done." Hayes looked at Dalton with irritation. "I will decide when I am done." Naomi's eyes moved between them. "Officer Hayes, my license is valid. My registration matches. The vehicle belongs to me. You have confirmed I am not wanted for anything. Am I free to leave?" Hayes stared at her. "Why are you in such a hurry?" Naomi almost could not believe the question. "Because I was going home. Most people would just cooperate and let us finish. I have cooperated. You have questioned everything I have asked." Naomi's voice stayed measured. "Asking why I am being detained is not refusing to cooperate." Hayes took a step closer, not threatening, but deliberate. "You keep using that word. Because you will not tell me whether I am free to leave." Dalton exhaled slowly. "Brad, answer her." Hayes turned toward him. "Stay out of it. I am already in it." That changed something. Hayes looked at his partner as though Dalton had crossed an invisible line. Naomi saw it immediately. This was no longer simply about her. Hayes now seemed equally frustrated that another officer was questioning his judgment. "Officer Hayes," Naomi said, bringing his attention back to her. "What reasonable suspicion do you currently have that I committed an offense?" Hayes gave a short, humorless laugh. "You really know the terminology. That is not an answer. Where did you learn it?" Naomi paused. She could have ended part of the mystery right there. She could have told him exactly where she worked, what badge she carried, and what rank appeared beside her name. Instead, she considered the question beneath his question. Why did her knowledge require an explanation? "I learned it because citizens should understand what authority can and cannot require of them," she said. Hayes studied her face. "That sounds rehearsed." "It sounds familiar because the law is not supposed to change depending on who is standing in front of you." Dalton looked down for a moment. Marcus Reed had moved slightly closer, still maintaining distance. Hayes glanced toward him. "Sir, do you need something?" Marcus shook his head. "Just waiting by my car." Hayes looked back at Naomi, clearly aware now that the encounter had witnesses. Naomi noticed the body camera indicator still active on his uniform. She took a slow breath. "Officer Hayes, I have answered your questions. You have verified the vehicle and my identification. I am asking you directly. Am I being detained?" This time Hayes could not pretend he had not heard her. Hayes finally answered the question he had avoided for several minutes. "Yes. For now, you are being detained while I complete my investigation." Naomi did not react with surprise. She had already understood the practical answer from the moment he refused to return her license. What mattered now was that he had said it clearly, with his body camera recording and his partner standing close enough to hear every word. "For what suspected offense?" she asked. Hayes looked toward the SUV. "I have explained that I am investigating suspicious activity. You said the original call involved an argument outside the pharmacy." Dalton looked at Hayes before speaking. "It did." Naomi continued. "Was I involved in that argument?" Dalton shook his head. "Not that we know of." Hayes frowned at him. "Eric," she asked a factual question. Naomi kept her attention on Hayes. "Was my SUV identified in the call?" Hayes hesitated. "No." "Was a black woman matching my description identified in the call?" The parking lot seemed quieter despite the traffic moving behind them. Hayes shifted his stance. "There was no specific description." Naomi nodded once. "Then what fact connected me to the call?" Hayes looked toward Marcus Reed, who remained near his sedan. "I observed behavior that caught my attention." "What behavior?" "You were standing beside this vehicle." Naomi waited. Hayes added, looking around. "I was looking for my keys." "That is your explanation." "And the key opened the vehicle." Dalton lowered his gaze toward the pavement. The facts had become almost painfully simple. Naomi could feel Hayes searching for complexity because simplicity no longer supported him. Marcus took a few steps closer, stopping well outside the officer's working space. "Officer," he said carefully, "I saw her come out of the grocery store." Hayes turned toward him. "Sir, I need you to stay back." Marcus immediately stopped. "I am staying back. I just thought you should know." "Did you see what happened before she came outside?" "I saw her walk from the store to that car with groceries." Hayes looked irritated. That does not mean you saw everything. Marcus nodded. No, sir. It means I saw that. Naomi noticed the precision of his answer and appreciated it. He did not exaggerate. He did not claim knowledge he did not have. He simply offered a fact. Dalton looked toward Marcus, then at Hayes. Brad, we have her identification, registration, valid license, matching vehicle information, and a witness saying she walked straight from the store. Hayes replied quietly, I know what we have. Then what are we waiting for? Hayes's expression tightened. I want dispatch to run a complete check. Naomi looked at him. You already ran my license. I am checking your name through the department system. For what? Because I can. The words landed differently from everything else he had said. Dalton's face changed immediately. Hayes seemed to realize it too, but he did not correct himself. Naomi remained still. She had heard officers use authority carefully, reluctantly, even apologetically when circumstances required it. She had also heard authority used as an answer when evidence could no longer provide one. That is not the same as having a reason, she said. Hayes looked directly at her. You seem determined to tell me how to do my job. Naomi's expression remained composed. No, I am giving you every opportunity to explain how you are doing it. Dalton looked at her again, studying not only the words but the measured way she delivered them. You said your contact with law enforcement was professional, he said. Hayes glanced toward him. Naomi did not answer immediately. That is correct. Dalton's curiosity deepened. Attorney? No, court employee? No, Hayes interrupted. It does not matter. Naomi looked at him. Then why did you ask where I worked? Before Hayes could respond, his shoulder radio crackled. Dispatch called his unit number. Hayes reached for the microphone. Naomi watched him, her face unreadable. Dalton turned toward the radio as well. Somewhere inside the department database, Naomi Carter's name had finished moving through the system. The facts Hayes had been searching for were finally coming back. Hayes lifted the radio microphone toward his mouth. Go ahead, dispatch. A brief burst of static crossed the parking lot before the dispatcher answered. Unit 12, confirming your subject is Naomi Elaine Carter. Date of birth matching the license provided? Hayes looked at the card in his hand. Affirmative. Naomi remained beside her SUV, her posture unchanged. Dalton watched Hayes with growing attention, while Marcus Reed stood quietly near his sedan. Stand by, the dispatcher said. Hayes lowered the microphone. Several seconds passed. A shopping cart rattled across the pavement in the distance. The grocery store doors opened and closed behind them. Naomi glanced at the coffee resting on the roof of her SUV. It had probably gone cold by now. Something about that ordinary detail made the situation feel even more unnecessary. She had come here for groceries. She had planned to drive home, call her mother, eat dinner, and forget about work for the evening. Instead, she was standing beneath a parking lot light while an officer searched for a reason to justify a suspicion that every available fact had already weakened. Dalton spoke quietly. You said you had professional contact with law enforcement. Naomi looked at him. I did. Recently. Very. Hayes turned toward them. Can we stop with the questions until dispatch finishes? Naomi almost pointed out the irony, but chose silence. Hayes had asked questions for nearly 20 minutes. Now that someone else was asking them, he wanted the conversation paused. The radio crackled again. Unit 12. Hayes raised the microphone. Go ahead. No wants or warrants. Driver status valid. Vehicle registration confirms the information previously provided. Dalton exhaled. There you go. Hayes did not respond. Anything else? He asked dispatch. There was a pause. Stand by. There is an agency return attached to that name. Dalton's expression changed. Naomi looked toward the patrol car, but said nothing. Hayes straightened slightly. What kind of agency return? Confirming. Another pause followed. Hayes glanced at Naomi as though expecting her to explain. She did not. The dispatcher returned. Naomi Elaine Carter is listed as active law enforcement personnel. Dalton looked immediately at Naomi. Hayes remained still. Repeat that, he said. Active law enforcement personnel, dispatch repeated. Current assignment listed with the Metropolitan Police Department. The silence afterward was different from every silence that had come before it. Dalton stared at Naomi with sudden recognition, replaying her precise language, her controlled movements, her questions about detention, reasonable suspicion, and body cameras. Pieces that had seemed unusual now fit together perfectly. Hayes lowered the microphone slowly. You are a police officer? Naomi looked at him. You asked where I worked. You never established why that information was relevant. Hayes blinked. Why did you not just tell me? Naomi's expression remained composed. Would that have changed whether my registration was valid? That is not what I asked. Would it have changed whether this vehicle belonged to me? Hayes said nothing. Dalton stepped slightly closer. What is your assignment? Naomi looked toward him. Detective Division. Dalton's eyebrows rose. Hayes glanced at the radio again. Dispatch, confirm assignment. The response came almost immediately. Confirmed. Detective Division. Hayes seemed to relax for half a second, as if learning she was another officer offered him a path out of the encounter. All right, he said, extending her license. Looks like we got this cleared up. Naomi did not take it immediately. She looked at the license, then at him. No, Officer Hayes. You confirmed something about me that you never needed to know in order to establish that I owned this vehicle. Hayes kept his arm extended. There was a misunderstanding. Was there? Dalton looked toward the radio, where the dispatcher had not yet cleared the channel. Then the speaker crackled once more. Unit 12, additional personnel information available. Hayes hesitated before raising the microphone. Go ahead. The dispatcher's next words came clearly through the evening air. Rank is Detective Lieutenant. Dalton's face went still. Hayes slowly lowered Naomi's license. For the first time since approaching her, he was no longer looking at a woman he believed needed to explain why she belonged beside that SUV. He was looking at a superior officer who had spent the entire encounter watching exactly how he treated someone when he believed she had no authority at all. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The words Detective Lieutenant seemed to remain, suspended beneath the parking lot lights, changing nothing about the facts, and yet changing everything about the way Bradley Hayes now looked at Naomi Carter. His shoulders lowered slightly. His voice, when it returned, had lost its edge. Lieutenant Carter, I was not aware. Naomi finally reached for her driver's license. Hayes handed it over immediately. That is exactly the problem, she said. Dalton looked between them. Hayes cleared his throat. If you had identified yourself as law enforcement from the beginning, we could have avoided all of this. Naomi placed her license back into her purse. Could we? Of course. Why? Hayes frowned. Because I would have known who I was dealing with. Naomi held his gaze. You knew who you were dealing with. I gave you my name. I showed you identification. I showed you registration. You verified the vehicle. You verified my license. What you did not know was my occupation and rank. Hayes glanced toward Dalton, but his partner offered no rescue. I was being cautious, Hayes said. Caution should respond to evidence. It does. Then explain when your suspicion should have ended. Hayes opened his mouth, but stopped. Naomi continued, still speaking quietly. Was it when the key opened my vehicle? Was it when my license matched the registration? Was it when the vehicle identification matched? Was it when dispatch confirmed my license was valid? Was it when you learned I had no warrants? Or was it only when you learned I carried a badge? Dalton lowered his eyes. Marcus Reed remained near his sedan, listening from a respectful distance. Hayes looked toward the patrol car. I was trying to make sure everything was legitimate. Naomi nodded. And now that you know I am a police lieutenant, am I suddenly legitimate? Hayes turned back toward her. That is not what I meant. Then tell me what changed. He had no immediate answer. Naomi glanced at the body camera on his chest. The indicator was still active. Your tone changed. Hayes stiffened. I am showing respect for your rank. You called me ma'am before. Now you are calling me lieutenant. That is not the part that concerns me. She paused. The part that concerns me is that you stopped treating me like a suspect the moment you discovered I was one of you. Dalton looked directly at Hayes now. The statement was impossible to misunderstand. Hayes tried again. There was suspicious activity reported in this area. And you already confirmed I was not connected to it. I made an observation. You saw a black woman beside an expensive vehicle. Hayes's face tightened. I never mentioned your race. Naomi's expression did not change. Bias does not require someone to announce it. The parking lot seemed suddenly smaller. Hayes looked toward Marcus, then toward the grocery store entrance, where a few customers continued moving through the automatic doors. Are you accusing me of racism? He asked. Naomi considered the question carefully. I am telling you what happened. You questioned whether my vehicle belonged to me. Every piece of evidence confirmed that it did. Instead of reducing your suspicion, each answer produced another question. You asked why I was shopping here, where I lived, where I worked, whether I had prior contact with law enforcement, and why I was driving this vehicle. Then you detained me without identifying a specific offense connecting me to the call you had already resolved. Hayes looked down for a moment. Naomi's voice softened, but the words became sharper. And then dispatch said I was police. And suddenly you wanted this encounter to be over. Hayes said nothing. Naomi looked at Dalton. Officer Dalton, did your body camera record the entire encounter? Dalton nodded. Yes, Lieutenant. Good. Hayes looked up quickly. Lieutenant, there is no reason to turn this into something bigger than it was. Naomi met his eyes. I am not making it bigger, Officer Hayes. I am making sure it stays exactly what it was. The room had changed before anyone said a word. 10 minutes earlier, Officer Daniel Mercer had stood beside the conference table with the easy confidence of a man who believed suspicion only traveled in one direction. Now he watched Deputy Chief Elena Brooks enter through the glass doors, followed by 2 federal officials in dark suits, and something inside his expression quietly collapsed. Maya Carter remained seated beneath the pale fluorescent lights, her hands resting calmly on the table. She did not smile. She did not need to. Brooks placed a sealed folder in front of the precinct commander and spoke with the measured precision of someone who understood that truth became most powerful when it did not have to shout. Before anyone continues questioning Ms. Carter, there is something this department needs to understand. Mercer shifted his weight. The commander opened the folder. His eyes moved across the first page, then stopped. He looked at Maya, then at the federal officials, and finally back at Mercer. The silence stretched until even the humming air conditioner seemed loud. Maya slowly rose. My name is Maya Carter, she said. I am a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. No one moved. Mercer blinked as though the words had arrived in a language he could not understand. The officer near the doorway lowered his eyes. Another stared at the floor. Every assumption that had carried Mercer through the afternoon suddenly looked different beneath those lights. The woman he had treated like she did not belong had spent 16 years serving the country. More importantly, she had not entered that neighborhood by accident. For nearly 8 months, Maya had been helping lead a federal civil rights investigation into complaints involving unlawful stops, altered reports, missing camera footage, and a pattern of citizens being treated differently because of race. Mercer opened his mouth. I did not know who she was. Maya looked directly at him. Her voice remained quiet. That is the problem. For words. Nothing more. Yet they landed harder than any accusation. Imagine hearing them in that room, with every excuse suddenly stripped away. Because Mercer had just admitted the truth without realizing it. He believed his conduct might have been different if Maya had carried visible authority. If she had arrived with credentials displayed. If someone powerful had introduced her first. But dignity was never supposed to depend on rank. Respect was never supposed to require a federal badge. Brooks turned toward the commander. The street camera was recovered. Mercer went still. So was the convenience store footage, one of the federal officials added. And the patrol vehicle recording. The commander slowly closed the folder. This was no longer one woman's word against one officer's report. There were timestamps, witness statements, dispatch records, video. And now there was Maya, standing in the center of the room, not as the frightened stranger Mercer thought he could define, but as the investigator who had been quietly studying the very system that protected him. For the first time that day, Mercer had nothing to say. Maya reached into her jacket and placed her credentials on the table. The gold seal caught the cold overhead light. You kept asking me who I was, she said. You should have been asking whether what you were doing was right. And in the silence that followed, everyone understood the difference. Mercer stared at the federal credentials on the table as if the gold seal had changed the temperature of the room. But Maya understood something he did not. The badge was not the consequence. The evidence was. Deputy Chief Elena Brooks opened the recovered incident file and placed 3 printed reports beside the patrol records. Each told a slightly different version of the same afternoon. Different times. Different reasons for the stop. Different descriptions of Maya's behavior. The contradictions were small enough to hide inside paperwork, but together they formed something impossible to ignore. Officer Mercer, Brooks said, effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Mercer looked toward the precinct commander. You cannot be serious. The commander did not answer. One of the federal officials stepped forward. This investigation is larger than today's incident. That sentence changed everything. Mercer had believed he was facing one complaint. Instead, Maya's team had spent months examining a pattern. Traffic stops that ended without citations. Citizens detained and released without charges. Body camera files labeled corrupted. Reports containing language so similar that investigators began comparing them line by line. Names that had once existed separately were now connected by dates, locations, and signatures. Mercer looked at Maya. For the first time, there was no contempt in his eyes. Only uncertainty. "So this was a setup?" he asked. Maya's expression remained steady. "No. Nobody told you how to treat me." The room fell silent again. That truth left him nowhere to hide. No one had instructed him to make assumptions. No one had forced him to dismiss her explanations. No one had written the words he later placed into his report. Those choices belonged to him. Brooks collected Mercer's department identification and service credentials according to procedure while the commander formally documented the suspension. There was no shouting, no celebration, no humiliation returned for humiliation received. That was what surprised Mercer most. Maya had every reason to make the moment personal, yet she refused. "Why are you not angry?" he finally asked. Maya studied him for several seconds. "I am angry," she said. "But anger is not what brought me here." She turned toward the glass wall overlooking the precinct floor. Officers who had once avoided looking at her were watching now. There are people who walked into this building without federal credentials. They deserve the same dignity I did. Some of them had no one powerful to call. No investigation waiting behind them. No deputy chief walking through the door. Mercer lowered his eyes. Outside, evening had settled over the city, and headlights moved across the wet pavement beyond the station windows. Inside, investigators began securing records, preserving camera files, and notifying internal affairs that the case had expanded. The system Mercer had trusted to forget small complaints was finally being forced to remember them. Maya picked up her credentials, but left the reports on the table. Those pages mattered more than her title ever could. As she reached the doorway, Mercer spoke quietly. "What happens to me now?" Maya stopped without turning around. "The evidence gets heard." It was not revenge. It was something far more difficult to escape. Accountability. 3 months later, the precinct looked almost the same from the outside. The same brick walls stood beneath the morning sun. The same American flag moved above the entrance. Patrol cars still rolled through the parking lot. Radios still carried voices across the building, and people still walked through those doors hoping the system would treat them fairly. But inside, something fundamental had changed. The federal investigation had expanded beyond Daniel Mercer. Records once dismissed as routine were reopened. Complaints that had gathered dust were reviewed again. Camera policies were rewritten. Supervisors were required to document questionable stops, and an independent review board began examining cases that had once disappeared behind administrative language. Mercer faced a formal disciplinary hearing after investigators confirmed serious inconsistencies between his report and the recovered recordings. He lost his position with the department, and several supervisors who had ignored earlier warnings were removed from command while their conduct was reviewed. Yet Maya Carter never celebrated any of it. She understood that removing one officer could not repair every person who had entered that building and walked away feeling smaller. Accountability could close a case. Healing required something more. On a cool October morning, Maya returned to the neighborhood where the investigation had begun. She wore no visible credentials this time. Just a dark blue coat, simple shoes, and the same quiet expression she had carried through every accusation. Across the street, an older black man named Walter Reed stood outside the convenience store. Months earlier, Walter had been one of the witnesses who refused to look away when Mercer questioned Maya. He recognized her immediately. "Agent Carter," he called. Maya smiled softly. "Maya is fine." Walter crossed the sidewalk and offered his hand. "I heard what happened." Maya nodded. A lot of people finally got heard. Walter looked toward the street. Should not have taken someone important for them to listen. The words stayed between them. Maya knew exactly what he meant. Her federal position had opened doors, but the truth had never belonged only to her. It belonged to every person whose complaint had been dismissed. Every parent who had worried when a child drove home late. Every citizen who understood that dignity should not depend on clothing, neighborhood, profession, or skin color. "You were important before anyone knew your name," Maya told him. Walter looked back at her, and for a moment neither spoke. Cars passed. Somewhere nearby, a school bus stopped and children climbed aboard, laughing beneath the pale autumn sunlight. Life continued, ordinary and fragile. Maya watched them and remembered Mercer's question from that final evening. What happens to me now? At the time, she had answered that the evidence would be heard. Now she understood the deeper answer. What happened next depended on what everyone learned from the truth. A badge could represent service, but it could never place its wearer above accountability. Authority could command attention, but character determined whether that authority deserved respect. And justice was never proven by how a system treated the powerful after discovering who they were. Justice was proven by how it treated the person whose name meant nothing to anyone in the room. Maya turned toward the morning traffic and continued down the sidewalk. She did not need anyone to recognize her. She had never needed that. Because dignity does not begin when power enters the room. Justice begins when every human being is treated as though they already matter.